Hi, everyone. I'm your host, Lauren Conlin, and today I am taking you all back to the year 2003, New York City, a very cold January afternoon. As a side note, a few short months later, a very naive version of me would be moving to this city, but very aloof to the fact that heinous crimes were happening mere steps, feet, miles from where I was living in Midtown Manhattan. The case that I'm about to get into, it's cruel on so many levels. I truly think that that's the best word for this case. It's simply cruel, and you'll see why. So let's go to Laconia Avenue in the East Bronx, where the red brick houses were built in the 1950s, and according to the people in this quaint neighborhood, they treated each other like family, and even sometimes exchanged house keys in case of emergencies. Laconia Ave was considered a safe residential neighborhood due to its low crime rate. A very sweet woman, Nelli Hocutt, a 91-year-old grandmother and beloved figure in the Bronx, lived on Laconia Avenue, and she had lived in this home for 50 years, becoming almost a matriarch to her community. She was very independent, and everyone that knew her said she was very sharp. She still even drove herself to church every Sunday and kept a very watchful eye on the Bronx block. Neighbors described her as, quote, the heart of the community. But on January 10th, Nelli Hocutt's neighbors noticed something wasn't exactly right in Nelli's world. I mean, they knew her. They knew her routine. They were close friends with her for the last 45 years. But the morning of January 10th, in particular, they noticed that Nelli's black Buick Century was parked in her driveway instead of the garage. This was a break from her normal routine. And even more concerning, her garbage hadn't been taken out. The neighbors tried to call Nelli, but she didn't answer. They got a little closer to her front door, and they noticed that it was ajar. They didn't go inside. They were alarmed, and so they called the police. When officers arrived at 3765 Laconia Avenue, they peered through Nelli's tiny mail slot, and they made a horrifying discovery. This would be a crime that would haunt them for years. The officers then called in the homicide task force in the Bronx. When homicide detective Nicholas Ciuffi and detective Curtis Harris arrived, they were truly in shock at what they saw. In the living room sat 91-year-old sweet Nelli Hocutt, lifeless and bound to a chair. Wrapping tape tightly encircled her torso, pinning her to the chair, while her wrists and ankles were secured with a telephone cord. A plastic grocery bag was pulled over her head, held in place by a scarf, and her face was covered with a white towel. It was clear to the detectives this was no ordinary robbery that had gone wrong. Nelli's living room was in total disarray, but beneath the chair that Nelli was tied to, they found an almost empty bottle of wine and a broken wine glass, as if someone had forced her to drink it. And then there was an empty whiskey bottle that lay nearby, along with a pillow bearing a very large footprint. And then there was a paper towel stained with red, although it wasn't blood. This was just sitting among a mess of other items scattered across the room. The upstairs bedroom had also been ransacked. Drawers were pulled out, clothes hanging halfway out of the drawers. I mean, it was clear that someone had rummaged through Nelli's personal belongings, searching for something specific or valuable. In the dining room, Nelli's purse was turned over on the table, all of the contents dumped out in what seemed like a hurry. Meanwhile, in the kitchen, there were 2 bags of groceries completely abandoned on the floor. This was just a haunting reminder to the detectives that Nellie had most likely been going about her daily routine, unpacking groceries, before this vicious attack had begun. Detective Ciuffi spoke with the neighbors and Nellie's granddaughter to get a clearer picture of who Nellie was. They described Nellie as sharp, independent, extremely cautious. She was the kind of person who always locked her doors and rarely allowed visitors inside her home, even if she'd known them for years, unless there was a specific reason for them to be there. But the biggest clue came from the locked front door. None of the windows or other doors showed any signs of forced entry. Detective Ciuffi quickly formed a theory. Well, whoever did this was either someone Nellie trusted, she trusted them enough to let them inside, or someone who followed her in and caught her off guard. Did somebody offer to help Nellie carry in these groceries? And this crime scene, it just painted the most brutal and horrific picture. A terrifying struggle, a sweet, older woman, an innocent woman who was attacked in the safety of her own home. And again, the biggest mystery here is who did this and why would they do something so evil for essentially this, what they took from the home? $120 in cash, a gold chain, and half a dozen bath towels. Literally, that is all this killer took. So the detectives knew right away. They were chasing a dangerous person, but they had no idea how cruel and complex this case was about to become. This very tight-knit Laconia Ave community was left shaken to their cores. They kept thinking to themselves, who could have done this? Who could have murdered sweet Nelli Hocutt? And to make matters worse, for nearly 4 years, the case went cold. And sure, police were able to get some fingerprints off of certain things in Nellie's apartment, but it didn't match anything or anyone in their database. Police had no leads, no suspects, and no answers. But in June of 2007, everything changed. The NYPD Crime Stoppers hotline got a tip from a tipster who said that it was a woman, had been carrying a dark secret for years. And then the caller told detectives a story so chilling that it had haunted her, this tipster, since the day that she first heard it. Now, this tip, it was not vague. This woman revealed things to detectives that had not been yet released to the media. Law enforcement had purposely weeded out all the details in order to avoid false tips. But let's back up a minute. Let's back up to this tipster who we now know as Larissa Kirby. And I'm about to drop some names that you should probably keep in the back of your mind. Larissa Kirby was 24 years old when she found herself at the center of a murder investigation that she never expected to be involved in. Larissa worked as a ramp agent at the airport, but her connection to this case was personal. She had known a woman named Sparkle Daniel since the year 2000. In 2003, Sparkle Daniel was only 17 years old, and she had no criminal record. Sparkle Daniel's aunt had lived right next door to Nelli Hocutt, and these red houses on Laconia Avenue are described as being semi-attached to one another. So Larissa, through Sparkle Daniel, also met another friend named Nadine Panton. Nadine Panton was a bit older, about 26 years old, and she reportedly had been in some trouble in the past. So Sparkle and Larissa, They were closer friends, and they talked almost every day until things took a really dark turn in late 2003. It was during the spring of 2003 when Sparkle Daniel confided in Larissa about something that she was struggling with. She said she was having terrible dreams and she couldn't sleep. And Sparkle told Larissa a story that stuck with her. According to Sparkle, she and Nadine Panton had gone to her aunt's house when no one was home, and that's when they saw an older woman next door standing in front of her house, and Sparkle told Larissa that she and Nadine had asked the old woman to use her phone. The woman was very kind and trusting, and she let them inside. What happened next still makes Larissa's skin crawl. But Sparkle said that while she tried to make a phone call, Nadine started going through the older woman's belongings. Now, when the woman caught Nadine and asked the girls to leave, things spiraled out of control. Instead of leaving, Sparkle and Nadine tied the woman to the chair with a telephone cord and forced her to drink wine. When the woman struggled, they tied a scarf around her head and kept pouring wine until she stopped breathing. Larissa says that Sparkle thought that the older woman was going to tell her aunt what they had done, so she was terrified, and this is why the old woman had to die. Months later, in August of 2003, Larissa, and by the way, she did not tell anyone what her friend Sparkle Daniel had told her. Larissa was watching New York's Most Wanted on Channel 5 News with her mom and her grandma when a segment about a murder on Laconia Avenue in the Bronx flashed on the screen. The report described a woman who had been tied to a chair, forced to drink alcohol, and then suffocated, and Larissa just froze. She recognized the story immediately because it was the same one that her friend Sparkle had told her a few months earlier. Her grandmother saw her reaction, and Larissa ended up telling her grandma what was going on. And her grandma was essentially like, "Baby girl, you need to call the police." But Larissa refused. She didn't want to be labeled as a snitch or just have any involvement in murder investigations as a whole. She knew in her neighborhood, snitches get stitches. So instead, Larissa tried to call Sparkle, who was in Florida at the time, but Larissa wanted to warn her. So after several calls out to Sparkle that were unanswered, Sparkle finally called her back. So Larissa tells her about this news segment, this New York's Most Wanted segment, and Sparkle freaks out. Sparkle is like, "Okay, I need to talk to Nadine immediately." And what happens next is very odd. Sparkle, instead of hanging up with Larissa, she accidentally initiates a three-way call with Larissa still on the line. So Larissa listened to this conversation between Sparkle and Nadine silently. And she said she recognized Nadine's voice very clearly. She said, yeah, Larissa mentioned this news segment. They're looking for this old woman's killers. And Nadine told her to shut up, stop talking about the case on the phone. And then Nadine assured Sparkle that police wouldn't catch them because their fingerprints hadn't been left behind. Now, Larissa, she kept pretty quiet about what she had heard on that phone call, at least for a while. By 2007, a few years later, 4 years later, her relationship with Sparkle had fallen apart after a series of, let's call them, personal betrayals. Their friendship ended for good after Sparkle lied to her mother about money Larissa supposedly owed her, which wasn't true. And when Larissa confronted Sparkle's mother with the truth about this money, Sparkle retaliated, I guess, by writing to Larissa's husband, who was in prison, claiming Larissa had cheated on him with multiple men. So That was the final straw. Larissa was pissed. So not only did she not get this alleged money from Sparkle, and Sparkle lied about it, Sparkle told Larissa's incarcerated husband that Larissa was cheating. And by the way, I'm not sitting here saying Larissa's so great. I don't really know her, but she sat on this information for 4 years while the family of Nelli Hocutt was in a really dark place. I'll leave it at that. But yes, that was the final straw. She was angry. She wanted revenge. So Larissa called NYPD Crime Stoppers and she told them everything she knew. She named Sparkle and Nadine as the killers, and then she later followed up with the Bronx Homicide Task Force, speaking with someone named Detective James McSloy. She described how the women tied up Nelli Hocutt, forced her to drink wine, and ultimately suffocated her with a plastic bag. Her information matched key details about the crime that had never been released to the public, including the use of wine and a telephone cord. So Detective McSloy and the original detective, the responding detective, Detective Ciuffi, cross-checked her story and confirmed its accuracy. A few days later, Larissa met with the detectives in person and provided a signed, written statement detailing everything she knew. She even shared how she accidentally overheard Sparkle and Nadine discussing the crime during this three-way call. So now it was clear. Larissa's information was for sure the missing piece detectives needed to crack this case wide open. So now they are armed with Larissa's testimony and some new leads here, so detectives track down Sparkle and Nadine, setting the stage for their arrests and eventual trials. On July 19th, 2007, detectives in the late afternoon hours set off to Brooklyn to find Sparkle Daniel. They had her home address, a physical description, and a copy of her driver's license. One of the detectives thought they saw Sparkle leaving her house, so they recognized her and they ran up to her and they identified themselves and asked for her name. Sparkle refused to provide her name and tried to walk away, and detectives, again, calmly asked for her name and to see proper identification. And Sparkle became agitated but refused to answer any questions. And then after a while of going back and forth, she finally blurted, "I am fucking Sparkle Daniel." Then detectives handcuffed her. A couple of detectives then went to go track down Nadine Panton, while the other detectives brought Sparkle Daniel to the Bronx Homicide Task Force offices and placed her inside one of the cells. Sparkle was not cuffed, but about 15-20 minutes later, they go to get her and they bring her into an interview room. So Detective Ciuffi introduces himself, he pulls out a legal-size pad of paper, and he asks Sparkle, "Do you know why you're here?" And she's like, "Nope, don't know why I'm here." Then Ciuffi's like, "Okay, well, we're investigating the 2003 murder of an old lady." And Sparkle Daniel gave no response. But then about a minute later, a lieutenant interrupted Ciuffi and just said, "Hey, can you come out here for a minute?" And he basically was like, "Well, we're having a hard time tracking down Nadine Panton, so can you just help me out here and give us the information that you have and yada yada." And so during this time where he steps out, there is another detective inside the room with Sparkle Daniel. So after a few minutes, Ciuffi re-enters the interview room and says to Sparkle, "All right, you know what I'm talking about, don't you?" And finally, she says yes. And then without any further prompting, Sparkle says that she and Nadine Panton had gone to her aunt's house on Laconia Avenue, but that the door was locked. And then upon seeing Miss Hocutt, they asked her to use the phone. But before she could continue, detectives are like, whoa, we need to read you your Miranda warnings. So Detective Ciuffi writes down Sparkle's response to each Miranda question on his police form, and then he has her put her initials next to the responses and sign at the bottom of the form. Detectives Ciufi and his counterpart, Detective Mulroy, also sign it and note the date of July 19th, 2007 at 7. Great, that's out of the way. Now Ciufi can get back to his interrogation. So following the warnings, he again tells Sparkle Daniel, I'm investigating the murder of an old lady in the Bronx. And Daniel replies, yeah, I know this case. Trigger warning, I'm going to read to you directly from the original police affidavit of Sparkle Daniel's version of the events. What happened to the old lady who lived next door to my aunt who was murdered? Female, black, old, wore glasses. She would bring candy to my cousin who lived next door in 2003. I'm not sure. I think it was around springtime. It was cold outside. I was at Nadine's house that morning. Her house was on 216th and Laconia. I got up, took a shower, hung out with Nadine. Me and Nadine walked to my aunt's house, but she was not there. I knocked on Ms. Nelli's door, the top door. Ms. Nelli opened the door. I asked Ms. Nelli if I could use the phone to call my aunt. She let us both in the house. I made a call from the phone by the dining area. I called my aunt's phone number. It kept ringing, but I didn't bother to leave a message. I don't like leaving messages on people's voicemail. Ms. Nelli was standing in the kitchen by the counter. She was talking. She said, I remember you, to me. I said that Nadine is my friend after I used the phone. Nadine asked if she could use the phone to call her sister. I asked to use the bathroom. I used the one by the front door. I came out of the bathroom and said, if you seen my aunt, tell her I came by. Nadine pulled me aside by the bathroom. Nelli was past the stairs by the living room. I said, let's go to your house so I can get some sleep. Nadine said, nah, let's just rob her. I said, no, she knows my aunt. She knows what I look like. Nadine said, well, I'm not going nowhere. Then Nadine pushed Nelli. Nelli fell towards the steps. I said, I'm leaving. Nadine said, you're not going nowhere. I said, what do you mean I'm not going nowhere? I've known her a long time. I know what she is capable of. I know she gets into a lot of altercations. She drinks a lot and she smokes a lot of weed. Nadine went into the kitchen. She got a knife, bigger than a kitchen knife with a black handle. Nadine told Nelli to sit down in the chair. Nelli sat down. Nadine was pointing the knife at Ms. Nelli. Nadine said, where all your money at? Ms. Nelli said, over there, it's in my pocketbook. Nadine said, Sparkle, go over there and get the money. The pocketbook was on the table. I searched through it. It was like a bundle, about 100, 120. I gave it to her. I said, you got the money, so let's go. She was like, no, I'm going to do something to her. She closed the curtains in the front and locked the front door. She made her sit in the chair in the living room, then tied her up with tape around the chair, around her head, and on her hand, and then her foot. I was standing by the steps. She said, I'm gonna cut her neck, but she didn't do it. She started choking her with her hands, but it didn't work. Nelli was stronger. There was a bottle of kosher wine. She made Ms. Nelli drink it all. She held her head back, poured it down her throat. It was red or maroon wine. She made her drink it until she died. Nadine checked her pulse by putting her finger on her neck. Nadine then took the chain around Ms. Nelli's neck. She left Ms. Nelli tied up. She put a plastic bag over her head that she got in the kitchen. She kept it over her head and tied it with a scarf. Nadine said that we can't go through the front door because someone's going to see us. It was in the afternoon and the sun was still out. I said, well, we can't go through the back door because there's no exit through the backyard. I said, there is a downstairs door you could try. Come on, let's go. We're going to go together. We went downstairs because her apartment is just like my aunt's. We went through the basement door. Nadine took the house keys and a bunch of keys. I said, why are you taking the keys? She said, mind your business. Don't worry about it. She also took paper towels from the basement area and she closed the inside door but left the outside door opened. We walked, left, and turned onto 220th Street. We walked left onto the next block and down to 216th Street. From 216th Street, we went to her house. I was living with Nadine at the time. When we got back in, she took off all her clothes, everything she had on except for her bra and panties, and threw it in a garbage bag. She threw it out in a garbage can outside of her house. I took off my white hoodie and put it in a bag. After that, she said, "You know you can't tell anybody because you could get in trouble too because you were there." The next day, we were watching the news on television. She said, "It's on the news." And I was like, oh my God. She said if I tell somebody that she was going to kill me. So for a couple of days, she had an attitude. And I started going to my other aunt's house on 226th and Baldwin. Her name is Karen Higgins. After a while, I took all my stuff and I went to Florida with my mother and my family. We stayed in Orlando for a week, and I talked to my cousin Fillion, who lives in Sanford. I stayed with her from like August until October of 2003. After this happened, me and Nadine never spoke about it again. This statement took about 45 minutes, and Detective Ciuffi wrote it down as fast as he could while she was talking, and at the end, he just said, "Okay, I'm going to read it out loud to you. I'm going to give you an opportunity to correct any mistakes." And he read it out loud. She said it was all good. And then the two detectives and Sparkle Daniel signed the bottom of the statement. But after reviewing this statement, Detective Ciuffi was like, "Wait a minute, Sparkle. I don't believe this story. This doesn't make any sense. I find it so incredible that there were two of you and Nadine, and only Nadine committed every single act, while you just so happened to stand there and watch without running away from the house." So he then says to Sparkle, "Okay, are you willing to tell me what really happened?" When Ms. Nelli was forced into the chair by Nadine, Nadine made Nelli get up. And she said, "Come on, where's the tape?" Ms. Nelli said, "Why are you doing this to me?" Nadine said, "I have to. If I let you live, you're gonna call the police." All of us walked towards the kitchen area. I found the tape in one of the drawers, duct tape. We all walked back to the living room area. Nadine made her sit down. She said to me, "Come over here and tie up her foot while I hold her hand." I got on my knees. Ms. Nelli tried to kick me with her foot. I said, "You might as well let me do it because she is going to do something to both of us, okay?" I tied her foot to the chair. I gave Nadine the tape. Then Ms. Nelli started screaming. She pulled a knife, Nadine, and said, "You better stop screaming before I cut your throat," to Ms. Nelli. After she said that, she said, "Give me the tape so I can tape her hands up." Then she tied her hands up. Nadine told me to get something to put in her mouth. I went to the kitchen and I got a dish rag. Nadine put it in Nelli's mouth. Nadine then choked Ms. Nelli with her hand. I was standing by the steps. That's when Nadine held Ms. Nelli's head back and poured the wine down her throat until she couldn't breathe anymore. After that, she told me to get a bag. I got a bag, a little grocery bag in the kitchen. I gave it to Nadine. She put it over Ms. Nelli's head. Her scarf was nearby. Nadine picked it up and then put that around her neck. She said, "Okay, she's dead, let's go. Check around the house to see if we find anything else." I responded, "No, I'm not going to." She put a knife to me. She said, "Let's go upstairs." We went upstairs. There was a bathroom, and we made a right to the bedroom. She said, "You're going to stand next to me, and I'm going to search the drawers." She searched the drawers, and now there were only clothes, so she didn't take anything. Nadine eventually took towels from the closet in the upstairs hallway and took them home with her carrying them in the street with her hands. She took the knife, too, because I didn't see her throw it out. I might have tied her with the phone cord, too. And spoiler alert, that really isn't the whole truth, but you'll hear more about what really happened later on. Detective Ciuffi wrote down the second statement. He read it back to Sparkle Daniel, and he said, "Is everything cool?" And she says, "Yes, this is correct," and she signs the bottom of it. And then he ends up giving her something to eat and drink. Sparkle Daniel was then taken to be fingerprinted while the detectives left to go and interview Nadine Panton. So after she had been fingerprinted and had something to eat and drink, then they get the video statement from her. The video statement seemed to match up, and Sparkle Daniel was treated fine. She had access to the bathroom throughout the night. At one point, she asked to make a phone call, and they said, yeah, you can make a phone call just after we finish the video interview, but she ended up not calling anyone. So now police are comparing statements between Sparkle Daniel and Nadine Panton, and they're checking some of the physical evidence that they've saved. Now, Sparkle had implicated Nadine, and Nadine had really implicated Sparkle. No surprise there. She actually went as far as to say that when she left, Nelli Hocutt was still alive. Maybe Sparkle Daniel came back and killed her. One thing, however, that was interesting was that the telephone records for Nelli Hocutt's residence revealed that no outgoing calls had been made from inside her house on the day of the murders. However, the expert in the field of fingerprint comparisons with the NYPD did examine 16 prints recovered from the scene, the crime scene. Of those, 2 of them recovered from the telephone receiver in the kitchen matched Sparkle Daniel's prints. Her prints recovered from the phone were very clear and easy to identify because there were no overlays of other impressions. So on this basis, the detective expressed absolute certainty that those prints recovered at the scene did in fact belong to Sparkle Daniel. And I gotta say, this little piece of information really made me realize that Sparkle Daniel ain't so innocent. She is not as innocent as she wants us to believe. She didn't make a phone call, but she sure as hell pretended to make one. But the true evil of Nadine Panton and Sparkle Daniel wasn't actually revealed until the autopsy report. I mean, we all thought we knew, but we didn't. I will read this directly from the report of Dr. James Gill, the Deputy Chief Medical Examiner at the time, who performed the autopsy on Nelli Hocutt. Ms. Hocutt, who was 91 years old, stood 5'3", 156 pounds, and had telephone wires wrapped around her ankles and her wrists. Ms. Hocutt had died from asphyxiation caused by a cloth gag and a plastic bag placed over her head. The presence of condensation inside the bag meant that she was still alive and breathing when the bag was placed over her head. The moisture was from Ms. Hocutt's breath. It would have taken minutes for her to suffocate to death. Ms. Hocutt had ingested alcohol recently before her death. She also had a gastric content of 0.03% methanol, a type of alcohol that can be poisonous in large amounts, and ethyl alcohol, which is also poisonous. The findings were not consistent with Ms. Hocutt having drunk a whole bottle of wine because of the absence of signs of vomiting. Sparkle lied. They poisoned Nelli Hocutt. They held her mouth open and they forced her to drink poison. And Nelli Hocutt had cuts in her mouth, indicating that a violent struggle had taken place. But the media dubbed this the, quote, plastic bag murder. And Sparkle Daniel was found guilty of second-degree murder in October of 2010, and she was sentenced to 25 years to life. Nadine Panton's trial was in December of 2010, and she was convicted of murder in the second degree and robbery in the second degree, and her sentence was also 25 years to life. Now, as heartbreaking as that case is, I wish I could say that that is the end of the heartbreak. The defendants were sentenced. Nelli Hocutt's family got some kind of justice and were able to begin their healing. But unfortunately, that wasn't the case. In November of 2014, a New York appeals court overturned the conviction of Sparkle Daniel. Yes, you heard me. The court ruled that Sparkle Daniel was not properly informed of her rights during questioning after she was arrested in the 2003 murder. Sparkle Daniels' attorneys argued that the pre-Miranda exchange was, quote, very brief and did not include any admission by the defendant of criminal conduct. And because of that, her post-Miranda statements were, quote, subsequently tainted. What? Okay, so now you see why I said this was an exceptionally cruel case. The appellate division stated that, quote, Court of Appeals precedent leaves this court with no alternative but to reverse, grant the motion to suppress the statements, and remand for a new trial, end quote. So because detectives initially questioned Sparkle Daniel by saying, hey, you know what I'm talking about, a few times, and then finally she says yes, and then on her own, she states that she and Nadine Panton went to her aunt's house, but the door was locked, and then they saw Nelli Hocutt and asked to use the phone. After that part, the detective stopped Sparkle Daniel and then read her Miranda warnings. So because of that exchange, her statements were tainted. I mean, that is one of the most wild things I have ever heard, and I cannot imagine being Nelli Hocutt's family. But the law is the law, and almost 4 excruciating years later, on March 20th, 2018, Sparkle Daniel was once again, after a second trial, convicted on second-degree murder for her role in the murder of Nelli Hocutt. She was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. And to close this very sad episode, I do want to give Nelli Hocutt a voice, so I'm going to read excerpts from the 2010 Victim Impact Statement. And to be clear, this was the Victim Impact Statement read at Nadine Panton's trial. And I think that you'll find that this victim impact statement actually fills in a few holes in my reporting. I found it interesting that the neighbors thought that Nelli Hocutt was very guarded and didn't let anyone inside her house, whereas her family says no, she was so hospitable and so friendly. Now keep all of that in mind while I read the statement. Good morning, Your Honor. My name is Kieran Whitfield. I'm Nelli Hocutt's grandson, and I'd like to thank you for giving Nelli Hocutt a voice from the grave. Whenever I reflect on the events of this living nightmare, one crystal clear image immediately springs to mind. Skull and bones. The symbolic significance of this image is the reason why the defendant sits before us today, convicted of this heinous crime. It's the universal symbol of death that is prominently displayed on all containers of poison, and it's the last piece of the puzzle that shows the truth about what really happened to my grandmother. I'll never forget that proud, heavy-set woman with the dark pigmentations under her wide, bright eyes, her head full of white hair, and her strong Georgia accent. She was the Girl Scout den mother, the devout churchgoer, and the self-sacrificing do-gooder, and the sympathetic ear. I remember how she always took a slightly hunchback position as she inched along at her snail's pace, supported by her long back and silver cane. Although she walked and moved very slowly, she always made it to all the parties, holiday celebrations, and graduations. The last party she attended was the one we gave for her 90th birthday, and her last holiday celebration was on New Year's Eve, 2003. This was 2 weeks before she was viciously executed by her next-door neighbor's niece, Sparkle Daniels, and Nadine Panton. When they saw my grandmother come home that sunny January afternoon, moving at her usual snail's pace with her grocery bags in one hand and her silver cane in the other, they were both immediately struck by the same sinister thoughts. They saw a great opportunity and easy prey. They took advantage of her love and trust and her southern hospitality and charmed their way into her home under the guise of needing to use the telephone. Once inside, they shed their human disguises and revealed their monstrous natures. They tackled her, bound her, gagged her, and ransacked her house in search of anything they could find of value. Once they had all they could find, there was no question of what needed to be done next. They knew too much and she had to die. The only question was how. Nadine, being the more experienced criminal and 9 years older than her 17-year-old accomplice, came up with the bright idea of making it look like an accident. In search for her valuables, she recalled seeing several different types of alcohol. There was lots of wine in the living room, the rubbing alcohol in the bathroom, and the poisonous methanol that she saw in the basement. We'll make her drink the poisonous alcohol, followed by the wine, and it'll look like she drank herself to death. She's already tied up, so all we have to do is force her to drink. But what they miscalculated was the incredibly difficult struggle they would have with a 91-year-old woman who was bound to a chair. They didn't consider that the red wine would soak all three of them. The crying, the begging, the pleading, the fighting, the blood that started to ooze from her mouth as they continuously jammed the wine bottle down her throat. The choking, the gagging, the horrible gurgling noises, the sickening stench of 3 types of alcohol mixed together, and the blood-curdling screams that forced them to stuff a rag in her mouth and abandoned that form of execution. There has to be an easier way, they both thought. Then Nadine noticed the beige plastic grocery bags on the floor next to the old woman's bright red scarf and immediately got another flash of brilliance. We can suffocate her with that plastic bag. Sparkle held her still, and Nadine put the plastic bag over her head, tied the scarf around her neck, and pulled it tight until she took her last breath. After participating in such a barbaric event, most people would never want to see another plastic bag again. But Nadine took one home with her and filled it with the dead woman's belongings. These profound images caused Sparkle to lose sleep and seek emotional support from her friend Larissa. But Nadine slept like a baby. Sparkle and Larissa's friendship was put to the test when Larissa learned there was a $12,000 reward for the information she had. Their friendship failed the test, and Larissa turned Sparkle in for money. When Nadine and Sparkle were arrested, Sparkle admitted to taking part in the robbery, but insisted that Nadine had killed by herself. But what she didn't realize was that the law clearly states that if you're in the process of robbing someone and they die, you are responsible for that death, even if you didn't kill them. This made Sparkle easy to convict, and her sentence was 25 years to life. But Nadine, being the more experienced criminal, admitted to taking part in the robbery and to seeing Sparkle force my grandmother to drink something, but insisted that she was alive when she left the house, and Sparkle must have come back to kill her. Of course, no one believed this ridiculous story, but it was surprisingly difficult to disprove. However, when the Emmy said that he had found methanol poisoning in her stomach and the prosecutor displayed the glass that was used to administer the poison, it immediately became clear that what Nadine saw Sparkle forcing Nelli, my grandmother, to drink was poison. Common sense tells us that there is no way you can see someone being forced to drink poison and not know that they are being killed. and the Emmy confirmed this belief when he pointed out several bruises and cuts inside the old woman's mouth, indicating that there was a more violent struggle that took place. For everyone in my family, this experience has been a nightmare that we will never wake up from. Our grandmother is gone for good, and after 91 years of a charitable, selfless, and honorable life, she died a slow, painful, and agonizing death. Because of that injustice, we have all suffered tremendously, and we have all been permanently changed. But in spite of it all, I'm not angry at Nadine Panton because I know that she is not a normal person. She's like a disease that has taken the form of a human being. She uses human emotions as a type of camouflage that allows her to blend in with the rest of us. And her total lack of compassion for other people is more beast-like than it is human. So I'm not angry at her, just like I'm not angry at cancer. People like her have always existed, and they always will. But don't get me wrong, I'm not saying she's sick, because she's not sick. She's just evil. And again, that was just a partial reading of the victim impact statement, but I want to make this clear that in New York, a 25-year to life sentence could result in parole. And in this case, this is truly sickening to me, knowing that someone like Nadine Panton or Sparkle Daniel, who treated an elderly woman like that, who is so defenseless. I mean, it's disgusting that they could actually be eligible for parole one day and have a life. I understand that Sparkle did not play the role that Nadine played, and that Sparkle was also very young. She was 17 years old. Can people change? Can they grow up? Yes, of course, absolutely. So it's my hope that Sparkle Daniel has changed. Nadine Panton? Well, I'm not so sure. All right, everyone. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Pop Crime TV's The Outlier podcast. If you like this podcast, don't forget to rate and subscribe wherever you listen to audio podcasts, or if you're listening on YouTube, don't forget to like and subscribe to Pop Crime TV. Stay vigilant, stay safe. Until next time.